The sky over Calith Prime turned the color of old rust. It had never looked like that before. For thousands of years, the sky had been soft blue, with two small moons that rose every evening like quiet friends. Now the sky burned, and the moons were gone, torn apart by something the Calith scientists did not understand, until it was too late. It started as a whisper in the data, a strange gravitational tremor, far out past the 9th planet of their system. The scientists called it an anomaly. They said it would pass. They were wrong. Within 3 months, the anomaly grew into a slow, silent monster, pulling apart moons, bending light, crushing anything that came too close. It moved toward Calith Prime, the way a tide moves toward the shore, patient and impossible to stop. Fleet Mother Issa Thren stood on the observation deck of the flagship, Windward Grace, and watched her homeworld shrink behind the ship's rear cameras. She was old, older than most Calith who still served in the fleet, and her 4 eyes had seen many hard seasons, but she had never seen anything like this. 6 million of her people were crammed into the ships behind her. Old generation vessels, cargo haulers turned into homes, mining ships stripped down and filled with families instead of ore. It was all they could save. Billions more had been left behind, too far from the ports, too slow to reach the evacuation zones in time. She did not cry. Calith did not cry the way some species did, but something in her chest felt hollow, like a room after the furniture has been taken away. "Fleet Mother," said a voice behind her. It was Corin Vall, a young officer with sharp eyes and sharper opinions. He had been assigned to her staff 2 years ago, back when the galaxy still felt safe. Fuel reserves are down to 11% across the fleet. Food will last maybe 5 weeks if we ration hard. We need to make a decision. "I know," Issa said. "Send the distress call again. Wider this time. Every frequency we have." Corin's jaw tightened. "We already tried the Thessaran Concord. They said our arrival would violate 17 different trade and border agreements. We tried the Veil hierarchy. They said helping us would use resources meant for their own citizens. We tried 3 of the old empires. 2 never answered. 1 sent back a message, saying they were reviewing our request through proper channels. That was 11 days ago. Then we try again," Issa said. "And again after that. What else can we do? Sit here and starve with our pride intact?" Corin looked away. He did not answer, because there was no good answer. He had grown up believing the galaxy was full of noble species who helped each other in times of need. That belief was dying faster than the fuel reserves. Days passed. Then weeks. The fleet drifted through empty space, a slow parade of tired ships carrying tired people. Children stopped asking when they would get to eat again, because the answer never changed. Old Calith gave up their portions for the young ones, and grew weaker every day. 2 ships had to be abandoned when their engines failed completely. The people aboard were squeezed into already crowded holds on other vessels, sleeping in shifts, because there was no room for everyone to lie down at once. Issa spent her nights reading reports of refusal. Empire after empire, council after council, all saying some version of the same thing. Not our problem, not our resources, not our risk. She began to understand a bitter truth. In this galaxy, mercy was rare, and it was never free. There was one species the Calith had not asked: humans. Corin brought it up first, in a meeting with the other ship captains, and he said it the way someone says something they already expect to be laughed at. "There's a human deep space monitoring outpost 2 weeks from our current position, near the edge of their claimed territory. We could reach their frequency range in a few days if we adjust course." One of the captains, an older Calith named Dross, made a sound of disgust. "Humans. We all know what they are. Young, violent, unstable. They fight among themselves more than any other species fights outsiders. Do you know what happened during the Corvid border skirmish? Do you know what they did to the pirate fleets in the Kessa Belt?" "I know what I've heard," Corin said. "Rumors. Propaganda, maybe. I don't actually know anything for certain, and neither do you." "They are dangerous," Dross said. "Everyone says so." "Everyone also said the anomaly would pass," Corin snapped, and the room went quiet. Issa raised a hand before it could turn into an argument. "We have asked everyone else, every civilized empire, every peaceful council, every species known for wisdom and restraint. They all said no. Perhaps it is time to ask someone the galaxy fears, instead of someone the galaxy praises. Adjust course. Send the signal toward human space. Dross protested, but he did not have a better plan, and in the end, no one did. The fleet turned, engines groaning under the strain, and began the long crawl toward the edge of human territory. It took 9 days to get close enough. On the 10th day, a small Caliph scout ship, the Low Wind, was sent ahead alone. It was faster than the rest of the fleet and carried a skeleton crew, just enough to fly it and operate the communication array. Corin volunteered to lead it himself. Issa did not want to let him go, but she understood why he needed to be the one. He wanted to see the truth for himself, not hear it secondhand. The Low Wind crossed into the edge of human-monitored space 3 days later. Corin sat in the cramped cockpit, staring at sensor readings that showed nothing but empty stars and the faint outline of a distant automated relay station. His hands hovered over the comm controls for a long moment before he finally pressed transmit. This is the Caliph vessel. Low Wind. Representing a refugee fleet of 6 million civilians. Our homeworld has been destroyed. We have been refused aid by every civilization we have contacted. We do not know your customs. We do not know your laws. We are asking anyway, because we have no other choice left. Please, we need help. He sent the message and then sat in silence, certain it would go unanswered, the way so many of his other messages had. He almost turned to tell his small crew to prepare for the return trip, to tell them it had been a foolish idea after all. Then the console chimed. A response had come back, not in 11 days, not in 3 weeks, in under 6 minutes. The voice on the other end was calm and a little tired, like someone who had been working a long shift but did not mind being interrupted for this. Caliph vessel. Low Wind. This is Seoul Deep Watch Station 7. We have received your distress call and forwarded it to Earth Central Command. Hold your position. Do not attempt to enter restricted zones. Help is coming. Corin stared at the console, unsure if he had heard correctly. Repeat that, please. I said hold on, the human voice said. Help is coming. We don't leave people to die out here if we can do something about it. Sit tight. Low Wind. You're not alone anymore. For a long moment, no one in the cockpit spoke. One of the younger crew members, a girl named Fenna who had lost both her parents in the evacuation, began to cry, quietly, the tension of the last months finally breaking loose. Corin did not stop her. He felt something loosen in his own chest, too, something he had not let himself feel since the day the sky over Caliph Prime turned red. He thought of Dross's warnings. Violent, unstable, dangerous. Maybe all of that was true. Maybe none of it was. But in this moment, after weeks of silence and refusal from species praised across the galaxy for their wisdom and honor, it was the supposedly dangerous ones who had answered in 6 minutes. Corin opened a channel back to the main fleet, his voice steady even though his hands were not. Fleet Mother. We found someone who will listen. Behind him, the stars ahead seemed a little less empty than before. Word of the human response spread through the Caliph fleet faster than any official announcement could travel. By the time Fleet Mother Issa Thren called a meeting of the ship captains, most of them had already heard some version of the story. A distress call answered in minutes, not weeks. Many did not believe it. A few refused to believe it even after Corin Vol explained it himself, standing tired and windburned in the meeting hall of the Windward Grace. Having flown back from the Low Wind. Only hours before. 6 minutes, Dross repeated, his voice thick with doubt. You expect us to believe a species with no formal alliance to us, no treaty, no reason at all, responded to a stranger's distress call in 6 minutes, when the Thessaran Concord took 11 days just to say no? I don't expect you to believe anything, Corin said. I was there. I heard the voice myself. They didn't ask what we could offer them in return. They didn't ask about our resources or our political standing. They just said help was coming. That is not how civilizations behave, Dross said. There is always a price. We simply do not know what it is yet. Issa raised a hand, and the room quieted. She was tired. More tired than she let herself show in front of the fleet. But her voice remained steady. Perhaps you are right, Captain Dross. Perhaps there is a price we do not yet understand. But consider our situation. We have 5 days of food remaining if we ration to the point of sickness. 2 more ships reported engine failures this morning. If the humans ask for something unreasonable, we can still refuse. But we cannot afford to refuse an offer of help before we have even heard what it costs. No one argued further. There was nothing left to argue with. The fleet held its course, drifting at the edge of human-monitored space, waiting. They did not have to wait long. 3 days after Corin's message reached Seoul Deepwatch Station 7, sensors aboard the Windward Grace detected an enormous return signal. Not a single ship, but dozens, then hundreds of individual transponder signatures, moving in formation from deep within human territory. The bridge crew of the Windward Grace stared at the display in stunned silence. Issa herself walked onto the bridge when she heard the alert, expecting perhaps a handful of small transport vessels, a token gesture wrapped in polite refusal. What she saw instead made her chest tighten in a way she did not have words for. The human fleet was not small. It stretched across the display in ordered lines, heavy cargo haulers the size of small moons, medical frigates with glowing green hull markings, fuel tankers, and warships flying escort on the flanks, not as a threat, but as protection. At the head of the formation flew a single vessel larger than the rest, its hull painted with symbols Issa did not recognize, though she would later learn it was the flagship of the United Nations Relief Fleet, a ship called the Mercy's Reach. "That cannot all be for us," murmured Niarkes, the fleet's chief engineer, standing near the main console. "That is not a relief convoy. That is an armada." Corin, standing near Issa's side, said nothing for a long moment. He was remembering Dross's warnings from days before. Violent, unstable, dangerous, and wondering how a species capable of assembling such an overwhelming force in only 3 days could also be the reckless savages the rest of the galaxy claimed them to be. Perhaps both things were true. Perhaps a species could be dangerous to its enemies and generous to strangers at the very same time. A transmission request blinked on the comm display. Issa nodded, and the channel opened. The voice that came through was different from the tired, calm voice Corin had heard on the low wind. This one was brisk, warm, and carried an accent Issa could not place. "Calith Fleet, this is Admiral Renata Osei, commanding the relief convoy. Mercy's Reach. We've got food, fuel, medical supplies, and enough life support modules to take pressure off your damaged ships immediately. We're going to need your ship IDs and current crew manifests so we can figure out where help is needed first, but that can wait until after we get supplies moving. Nobody needs to go hungry another day waiting on paperwork." Issa exchanged a glance with Corin. Even Dross, standing near the back of the bridge, said nothing. "Admiral," Issa said carefully, "we are grateful beyond words. But we must ask, what is the cost of this aid? What do you require of us in return?" There was a short pause on the other end, and when Admiral Osei spoke again, there was something almost gentle in her voice, though it did not lose its brisk edge. "Cost? Fleet Mother, you've got 6 million people who just lost their entire world, and you're asking me what it's going to cost you to eat dinner tonight. Let's get your people fed first. We can talk politics and paperwork after everyone's had a hot meal and a real bed. That's how we do things." The channel closed, and for several long seconds, no one on the bridge spoke. Dross was the first to break the silence, his voice quieter than Issa had ever heard it. "That is not what I expected. None of us expected any of this," Issa said. Over the following hours, the human fleet moved into position around the Calith ships with practiced efficiency. Cargo haulers extended docking tubes to every vessel capable of receiving them. Crews in unfamiliar uniforms moved through Calith corridors carrying crates of preserved food, medical kits, and water purification units, working quickly, but without the rough handling Corin had half expected from a species with a reputation for violence. On the Windward Grace, a human medical team led by a soft-spoken doctor named Amara Osei, Admiral Osei's younger sister, as it turned out, set up triage stations in the largest open bay and began treating the sick and malnourished without asking a single question about payment or political status. Corin watched from a doorway as Dr. Osei knelt beside an elderly Calith woman who had not eaten a full meal in almost 3 weeks. The woman flinched at first when the human reached for her arm to check her pulse, old fears surfacing despite her exhaustion. Dr. Osei simply smiled, slow and patient, and spoke in careful, gentle tones until the woman relaxed enough to let her work. "You're going to be all right," Dr. Osei said. We've got you now. It was such a small moment, easy to overlook amid the chaos of hundreds of similar scenes happening across the fleet at the same time. But Corin found himself unable to look away. He thought of every warning he had heard about humans throughout his life. The stories of border conflicts, the whispered rumors of ruthless efficiency in the Kessa Belt pirate purges, the general galactic consensus that humanity was a threat best avoided. None of those stories explained the woman kneeling in a crowded cargo bay, gently checking the pulse of a stranger from another world, asking for nothing in return. Later that evening, Fleet Mother Issa stood again on the observation deck of the Windward Grace, watching human supply shuttles move between the ships like a slow, steady heartbeat. Corin joined her, standing a respectful distance away. "I do not understand them," she admitted quietly. "Every empire we contacted spoke of treaties, resources, precedent. The humans spoke of dinner and beds." "Maybe that's the difference," Corin said. "Maybe everyone else asks what helping us will cost them. The humans just asked what we needed." Issa was silent for a long moment, watching the lights of the human ships glimmering steady and warm against the dark. 6 million of my people are alive tonight because of a species the rest of the galaxy calls dangerous," she said finally. "I wonder what else the galaxy has gotten wrong about them." Corin did not have an answer, but for the first time since the sky over Calith Prime had burned red, he allowed himself to feel something close to hope. Behind them, throughout the fleet, 6 million refugees ate a warm meal for the first time in weeks, surrounded by strangers who had asked nothing of them except to let themselves be helped. A week passed, and the Calith fleet began to change. Ships that had drifted in silence for months now hummed with quiet activity. Human engineers moved between the vessels, patching hulls, repairing failing life support systems, and rerouting power from the newly delivered fuel cells. The smell of real food, cooked and shared, drifted through corridors that had smelled only of rationed paste for weeks. Children who had stopped playing games during the long crawl through empty space started again, chasing each other around cargo crates while tired parents watched with something like relief on their faces for the first time in months. Fleet Mother Issa Thren walked those corridors often now, not because she needed to inspect anything, but because she wanted to see it. She wanted to remember what her people looked like when they were not starving. Still, not everyone adjusted easily. Captain Dross kept his distance from the human crews whenever he could, watching them with narrow, suspicious eyes, even as they worked tirelessly to keep his own ship from falling apart. He was not the only one. Old habits and older fears did not disappear simply because a warm meal had been served. Whispers moved through the fleet, some grateful, some cautious. A few still convinced that the humans were only being kind now, so that they could demand something enormous later. Corin Vall heard all of it, and disagreed with most of it, though he understood where the fear came from. He had grown up hearing the same stories as everyone else. It was strange to reconcile those stories with what he saw every day now. Human engineers skipping meals to finish urgent repairs. Human doctors working double shifts without complaint. Human pilots ferrying supplies between ships long after their official duty hours had ended. One afternoon, he found himself in the Windward Grace's main cargo bay, now converted into a shared workspace for coordinating repairs across the fleet. A young human engineer named Marcus Webb was crouched beside a damaged coolant line, muttering to himself as he worked. Corin had seen him several times over the past few days, always busy, always moving quickly from one task to the next. "You've been working 16 hours, Corin said, more out of curiosity than concern. "Your shift ended some time ago, did it not?" Marcus glanced up, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of a gloved hand. "Yeah, probably. Lost track. This line feeds coolant to your medical bay's cold storage. If it fails, you lose the vaccines we brought over yesterday. Figured I'd rather finish it tonight than let it wait. Someone else could finish it tomorrow." "Sure. But tomorrow somebody might need those vaccines." Marcus shrugged like it was the simplest thing in the world. "Where I'm from, you don't leave a job half done if people are counting on it." Corin considered that for a moment. "Where you are from sounds like a difficult place to grow up." Marcus laughed, a short, tired sound. "You have no idea. Humans have spent most of our history fighting each other, starving each other, standing by while whole cities burned, because helping felt too expensive, or too risky. We're not saints, Corin. We just finally got tired of watching people suffer and decided to stop looking away. Doesn't mean we always get it right, but we try. It was the most honest thing anyone from either species had said to Corin since the humans arrived, and it stuck with him long after Marcus returned to his work. That evening, Issa called a smaller meeting, not with the full council of captains, but with a handful of trusted advisors, Corin among them. Admiral Renata Osei, joined by holographic link from the Mercy's Reach. Her sleeves rolled up, clearly interrupted mid-task somewhere on her own ship. "I want to discuss what comes next," Issa said. "We are grateful for everything your people have done, but 6 million refugees cannot live indefinitely aboard damaged ships drifting at the edge of your territory. We must discuss resettlement, colonies, a future." Admiral Osei nodded, unsurprised by the question. "We've already started working on it, actually. There's a habitable system 2 weeks from here, inside neutral space but close enough to Earth that we can keep supply lines open. Terraforming's already partially done. An old colonial survey ran through there about 15 years back, before funding dried up. It's not perfect, but it's livable, and it's yours if you want it. No strings." "No strings," Dross repeated skeptically, from where he stood near the back of the room. "Admiral, forgive my bluntness, but we have never once been offered something for nothing. What does Earth gain from settling 6 million refugees so close to its own territory?" Admiral Osei's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened. "You want the honest answer, Captain? I would prefer it. Fine. Earth gains a grateful neighbor instead of an empty system nobody's using. Earth gains 6 million people who now know, firsthand, that we don't leave people to die when we can help. Earth gains whatever trade, friendship, or partnership grows naturally out of not being awful to people in need. But if you're asking whether there's a contract hidden somewhere demanding your loyalty or your resources in exchange for that colony, there isn't. You can take it and never speak to us again if that's what you want. I'd rather you didn't, personally, but it's your choice." The room was quiet for a long moment. Issa studied the Admiral's face through the hologram, searching for any hint of deception, any of the careful evasiveness she had grown used to after decades of dealing with the galaxy's great powers. She found none. "Why?" Issa asked finally, her voice quieter than before. "Why does humanity do this? Every other civilization we approached spoke of balance, of caution, of protecting their own resources first. Your people gave without hesitation. I do not understand the reasoning behind it." Admiral Osei was quiet for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "You want to know something about human history, Fleet Mother. For most of it, we were the ones asking for help and not getting it. Wars, famines, disasters, plenty of times, someone could have stepped in and didn't, and a lot of people suffered for it. We remember that. Some of us decided a long time ago that if we ever got the chance to be the ones with enough to share, we wouldn't make the same mistake twice. That's not some grand strategy. It's just, we know what it feels like to be the ones nobody helps. We didn't want your people to feel that." Corin thought of the 6-minute response, the overwhelming relief fleet, Marcus working 16 hours to save a shipment of vaccines. He thought of every warning Dross and others had given him about humanity's supposed recklessness and violence, and wondered how much of that reputation came from genuine danger, and how much came from a galaxy uncomfortable with a species that refused to look away from suffering, even when looking away would have been easier and safer. "We accept the offer," Issa said finally. "On behalf of the Kalith people, we accept." Admiral Osei smiled, the tiredness in her face easing slightly. "Good. I'll get the paperwork started. The boring kind, not the kind with strings attached. Welcome to the neighborhood, Fleet Mother." After the meeting ended and the others filed out, Corin lingered behind, watching Yissa stare at the star charts now displayed on the main console, marking the location of their new home. "You still have doubts," Yissa said, without turning to look at him. "Fewer than I did a week ago," Corin admitted, "but some habits are hard to unlearn. I keep waiting for the moment it all becomes complicated. For the moment, we discover the price we did not see coming." Issa finally turned to face him, her 4 eyes reflecting the soft light of the star charts. "Perhaps there is no hidden price, Corin. Perhaps the price is simply this, that we remember what was done for us. And someday, when another people find themselves abandoned and desperate, we do the same for them." Corin considered that for a long moment, and found he had no argument against it. Outside the observation windows, the human relief fleet continued its steady work among the Caliph ships, lights glimmering warm against the darkness of space. 6 million refugees drifting one day closer to a home they had never expected to find. The journey to the new system took 18 days, not the 2 weeks Admiral Osei had first estimated. Repairs on 3 of the older Caliph ships slowed the convoy, and a minor solar storm forced the fleet to alter course twice to avoid radiation exposure. None of the delays seemed to bother the human crews escorting them. If anything, the extra time gave both peoples more chances to learn about each other, in small ways that mattered more than either side expected. Corin Vall spent much of the journey aboard the human medical frigate. Steady hand. Officially as a liaison between the Caliph Council and the relief fleet, unofficially because he had grown curious about how humans organized themselves during a crisis. What he found surprised him. There was no single voice of command barking orders down through rigid ranks the way Caliph military structure worked. Instead, there were dozens of smaller teams, each trusted to make decisions within their own area, checking in with each other constantly, arguing sometimes, but always moving the work forward. Doesn't that create chaos? Corin asked Dr. Amara Osei one afternoon, watching a group of nurses debate loudly over the best way to reorganize a supply closet. Dr. Osei laughed, not unkindly. Looks like chaos, doesn't it? But everybody in that room knows their job, and everybody's allowed to speak up if they think something's wrong. We've learned the hard way that quiet order sometimes hides bigger problems. Loud disagreement usually means people care enough to fight about it. Corin thought about Dross, and the quiet, rigid order of Caliph command structure, where junior officers rarely questioned senior decisions, even when something seemed wrong. He wondered how many mistakes had gone unspoken over the years simply because no one had felt permitted to raise their voice. Not every human aboard the relief fleet shared Dr. Osei's patience, however. Corin overheard tense conversations more than once, supply officers arguing over whether the Caliph refugees were receiving too large a share of certain medical resources needed for human colonies elsewhere, engineers grumbling about the extra strain the aging Caliph ships put on repair crews already stretched thin. Humanity's generosity, Corin was learning, did not mean unanimous agreement. It meant a majority who believed the effort was worth the cost, alongside a vocal minority who did not. He raised this observation with Admiral Osei during one of their regular briefings. Not everyone back home is thrilled about this operation, she admitted honestly, when he asked. We've got politicians asking hard questions about budget. We've got citizens worried about resource strain, especially with 2 of our own colony worlds still recovering from a bad harvest season last year. It's not unanimous support, Corin. It never is, for anything worth doing. Then why continue? Corin asked. If your own people are divided, why not simply do less? Provide the minimum required and call it done? Admiral Osei considered the question seriously before answering. Because minimum effort isn't really help, is it? It's just enough to say we tried. We didn't come out here to say we tried. We came out here because 6 million people needed somewhere to go, and we had somewhere to send them. The arguments back home will keep happening. Doesn't mean we stop halfway through because some of it got difficult. It was a simple answer, but Corin found it difficult to forget. On the 12th day of the journey, the fleet encountered its first real test. A patrol of unmarked vessels, likely remnants of a pirate group that operated along the edges of neutral space, according to human sensor analysis, appeared on long-range scanners, shadowing the convoy from a distance. The Caliph ships, already worn thin from months of hardship, had almost no defensive capability left. Panic spread quickly through several vessels as word of the pirate ships reached frightened refugees who had already lost everything once and feared losing what little they had rebuilt. Fleet Mother Yissa called an emergency meeting, her calm expression masking real concern. "Admiral, what are our options?" Admiral Osei's voice over the comm was steady, almost bored, in a way that Corin found strangely reassuring. "Options are simple, Fleet Mother. We hold formation. Your ships stay in the center. Ours stay on the perimeter. If those pirates are smart, they'll realize attacking a convoy this size, escorted by a UN relief fleet, is a bad career move. If they're not smart, well, we'll handle it." For 6 tense hours, the unmarked ships shadowed the convoy without engaging, close enough to track on sensors but far enough to avoid direct confrontation. Corin stood on the bridge of the Windward Grace. watching the human escort ships adjust formation smoothly, efficiently, without any of the confusion or hesitation he might have expected from a species supposedly known for recklessness. There was nothing chaotic about how they responded to a genuine threat. It was precise, coordinated, and entirely focused on protecting the ships in the center of the formation, the Kalith ships, the refugees, the people who had nothing left to lose. Eventually, the pirate vessels peeled away, apparently deciding the risk was not worth the reward. A quiet cheer rose across several of the Kalith ships once the threat had cleared, relief evident in every voice that carried over the internal comm channels. Later that night, Corin found Admiral Osei alone on the observation deck of the Mercy's Reach, staring out at the stars. "You seemed very calm during the pirate encounter," he said, joining her at the viewport. "Was there truly no danger?" "There's always danger," she said. "I just didn't want 6 million already terrified people panicking over something we were prepared to handle." Calm is useful, Corin. Doesn't mean the fear isn't real underneath it. It just means you don't let the fear make your decisions for you. Corin nodded slowly, filing the thought away alongside everything else he had learned over the past weeks. Marcus working 16 hours to save a shipment of vaccines. Dr. Osei's patient care for a frightened, malnourished elderly woman. The Admiral's blunt honesty about humanity's own internal disagreements. None of it matched the stories he had grown up hearing about a violent, unpredictable species, best avoided by anyone with sense. Or perhaps, he considered, all of it matched, in a way he had not expected. Perhaps a species capable of great violence was also capable of great compassion, and the difference lay simply in which impulse they chose to follow when it mattered most. "May I ask you something personal, Admiral?" Corin said. She glanced at him, amused. "Go ahead." "Do you regret this mission? The cost to your people, the political difficulty back home, the risk from pirates and unknown threats along the way? Was it worth it, from where you stand?" Admiral Osei was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars drift past the viewport. "Ask me again in 20 years, she said finally. "Ask me when your people have built homes in that new system. When your children, and our children, are running around together, not even remembering a time when Kalith and humans were strangers. Ask me then whether it was worth it. I think I already know what I'll say. But I'd rather show you the answer than tell it to you now." Corin found himself smiling, an expression that still felt slightly foreign after months of hardship and grief. "I look forward to that conversation, Admiral." "So do I," she said. "Now get some rest, Corin. We've got a system to reach, and a fleet of 6 million people, counting on both of us to get them there in one piece." 6 days later, the convoy crossed into the edge of the new system, their new home, waiting quietly among the stars, untouched and unclaimed, offered freely by a species the galaxy had warned them to fear. As the first Kalith ships entered orbit around the pale green world below, a quiet, unfamiliar feeling settled over the fleet. For the first time since the sky over Kalith Prime had turned to rust and fire, it felt something like hope. The world below had no name yet, not one that meant anything to the Kalith, who now stared down at it from the observation decks of their tired, battered fleet. Human survey records simply called it designation KES 7, a pale green and blue sphere with 2 modest continents, wide oceans, and an atmosphere that had been carefully nudged toward breathable levels by an old terraforming project, abandoned when funding dried up years earlier. It was not perfect. Patches of the northern continent remained too cold for comfortable settlement, and parts of the atmosphere still needed scrubbing stations to filter out lingering industrial byproducts from the terraforming process. But it was solid ground, untouched by war, unclaimed by any hungry empire, and offered freely to 6 million people who had nothing left to call their own. Fleet Mother Issa Thren stood on the bridge of the Windward Grace. As the first landing shuttles departed for the surface, carrying engineers and survey teams, a mixed group of Kalith and human specialists working side by side for the first time, on solid ground rather than the deck of a ship. She found herself gripping the edge of the console tighter than she intended, watching the small shuttles grow distant against the green-blue curve of the planet below. "You seem nervous, Fleet Mother," Corin said, standing near her. "I am," she admitted. "For months, all I have known is survival. Ration counts, fuel reserves, distress signals. Now we are asked to imagine a future again. That is, in its own way, more frightening than the anomaly that destroyed our home. Corin understood the feeling better than he expected to. Survival had a strange, narrow focus that left little room for fear of the future. There was no time to imagine tomorrow when today demanded everything a person had. Now, with tomorrow suddenly possible again, the fear of failing to build something worthwhile out of this second chance felt heavier than he expected. The first weeks on Kes 7 were difficult, though not in the ways the Caliph initially feared. There was no shortage of food, no crisis of fuel or medicine, thanks to the continued support of the human relief fleet, which remained in orbit far longer than any of the original agreements required. The difficulty instead came from the enormous, exhausting work of building an entire civilization from almost nothing, clearing land, establishing power grids, constructing shelters sturdy enough to survive the planet's occasional harsh storms, and organizing 6 million displaced people into functioning communities. Human engineers brought prefabricated shelter modules by the thousands, dropped from orbit, and assembled on the ground within days rather than months. Caliph engineers, many of whom had spent their careers maintaining aging ships rather than building settlements from scratch, studied the human construction techniques with a mixture of admiration and mild embarrassment. "Your methods are remarkably efficient," said Niar Kes, the fleet's chief engineer, watching a team of human workers assemble a water purification station in under 6 hours. "We would have taken 3 days to accomplish the same task, using traditional Caliph methods." The lead human engineer, a broad-shouldered woman named Priya Anand, shrugged good-naturedly. "Necessity breeds efficiency. Earth's dealt with more natural disasters and refugee crises than I can count over the centuries. We've had a lot of practice getting people sheltered fast. Doesn't mean our way's better than yours, just faster for situations like this. I'd bet good money your ship maintenance techniques put ours to shame." It was a small exchange, but it captured something Corin noticed repeating again and again throughout those early weeks. A mutual respect growing quietly beneath the practical work of survival and rebuilding. Neither species treated the other as inferior. Humans did not act as saviors lording generosity over grateful refugees, and the Caliph, despite their initial hesitance, did not treat human assistance as an excuse to stop contributing themselves. Within the first month, joint work crews had become common practice across the growing settlement, humans and Caliph laboring side by side to raise the first permanent structures of what would eventually become a proper city. Not every part of the transition went smoothly. Cultural misunderstandings surfaced often, sometimes humorous, sometimes genuinely difficult. Caliph customs around communal eating, where families shared meals from a single prepared dish as a sign of trust and unity, clashed initially with human food distribution systems designed around individual rationed portions. It took the combined effort of several patient administrators from both sides to redesign the settlement's food distribution centers to accommodate Caliph customs without disrupting supply logistics. Language remained an ongoing challenge as well. Translation devices, provided by the human relief fleet, worked well enough for basic communication, but subtleties often slipped through the cracks. Corin found himself in more than one awkward conversation where a translated phrase carried entirely the wrong meaning, prompting confused or occasionally offended reactions before the misunderstanding could be sorted out. One particular incident became something of a legend among both peoples in the settlement's early history. During a community gathering meant to celebrate the completion of the settlement's first permanent medical center, a human volunteer attempted to offer a toast using a phrase translated directly from an old human expression, something about breaking bread together as a symbol of friendship. Unfortunately, the translation device rendered it into Caliph as a phrase carrying deeply insulting connotations related to destroying a family's ancestral home. The resulting confusion took nearly 20 minutes and considerable patient explanation from Corin himself to fully resolve, ending eventually in shared laughter from both sides once the misunderstanding became clear. "I did not expect diplomacy to involve quite so much explaining of accidental insults," Corin admitted to Admiral Osei during one of her periodic visits to the surface. She laughed, genuinely amused. "Welcome to interspecies relations, Corin. Half the job is just being patient enough to laugh about the mistakes instead of getting offended by them." Despite these challenges, the settlement grew steadily. By the end of the second month, the first permanent housing district stood complete. built from a blend of human prefabricated materials and traditional Caliph architectural styles that Niar Kess and his engineering teams had insisted on incorporating, wanting their new home to carry some visible piece of the world they had lost. Farms began producing their first modest harvests, supplementing the supplies still arriving regularly from human relief convoys. A council was formed, made up of both Caliph representatives and a small liaison team from Earth, tasked with managing the settlement's growth and addressing disputes as they arose. Fleet Mother Issa found herself, for the first time in nearly a year, sleeping through full nights without waking to check emergency reports or ration counts. It was a strange, almost uncomfortable peace, one she was still learning how to accept without suspicion. One evening, walking through the growing settlement with Corin at her side, she paused near the edge of what would eventually become the settlement's central plaza, watching human and Caliph children play together in the fading evening light, chasing each other around half-finished construction equipment, despite the mild scolding of nearby parents. "Do you remember what Dross said, back on the Windward Grace? Before we ever reached human space?" Issa asked. He warned that humanity would demand a price for their help, that such generosity does not exist without hidden cost. "I remember," Corin said. "I have been waiting for that cost to reveal itself," Issa admitted, watching for the moment their kindness turns into demand, their patience into control. "It has been nearly 2 months, Corin. I have found no such moment." Corin considered the children playing nearby, the joint work crews finishing the last section of the settlement's main water system in the distance. Admiral Osei's genuine laughter over an awkward translation error just days before. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "the price is simply this, that we remember, and that someday we do the same for someone else. You said something very similar once yourself, Fleet Mother, though I do not think either of us fully believed it at the time." Issa allowed herself a rare, small smile. "Perhaps I am beginning to believe it now." Above them, the sky of Kes 7 shifted into a deep violet dusk, utterly unlike the burning rust-colored sky that had marked the death of their homeworld. It was a different sky, over a different world, built not through conquest or inheritance, but through the quiet, deliberate generosity of a species the rest of the galaxy had warned them to fear. 6 million refugees were refugees no longer. They were, slowly and carefully, becoming something else entirely: settlers, neighbors, and perhaps, in time, friends. By the 4th month on Kes 7, the settlement had a name. The Caliph Council, after weeks of debate, chose to call it Ashen Hope, a name meant to honor both what had been lost and what had been found. Fleet Mother Issa Thren approved of it immediately, though Dross grumbled privately that it sounded too sentimental for an official settlement record. Nobody listened to his complaint for long. The name stuck, painted onto the welcome sign at the settlement's main landing pad within the week. Life in Ashen Hope had settled into something resembling routine, though routine still felt like a fragile, unfamiliar thing to most of the Caliph who lived there. Farms produced steady harvests now, supplemented less and less by human supply convoys as the settlement grew more self-sufficient. Schools had been established, staffed by a mix of Caliph teachers rebuilding lost curricula from memory, and human volunteers teaching basic Earth history, language, and science to any Caliph child curious enough to attend. It was in one of these schools that Corin Val found himself spending an increasing amount of his free time, not as a teacher, but as an observer, fascinated by how quickly the youngest Caliph adapted to their strange new circumstances compared to the adults around them. Among the children, one friendship in particular caught his attention: Fenna, the young Caliph girl who had cried quietly aboard the Low Wind. Upon hearing the human response so many months ago, had grown noticeably in both height and confidence since those early desperate days. She had lost her parents during the evacuation of Caliph Prime, and had been raised since then under the informal guardianship of several families aboard the Windward Grace. Though she often seemed to drift toward solitude when the demands of communal life grew overwhelming. That solitude had begun to change over the past 2 months, largely because of a human boy named Toby Reyes, the son of one of the settlement's medical liaison staff. Toby was younger than Fenna by perhaps a year, talkative in the easy, unguarded way many human children seem to be, and utterly unbothered by the physical differences between himself and his Caliph classmates. Corin first noticed them together during a school recess period, sitting beneath the shade of one of the settlement's newly planted trees, engaged in an animated argument over which of their homeworlds had better native wildlife. Fenna insisted, with great seriousness, that no Earth creature could possibly compare to the shimmering wing lizards that once nested in the canyon cliffs near her childhood home on Calith Prime. Toby argued back just as seriously that Earth's octopuses were clearly superior, capable of changing color and squeezing through impossibly small spaces. "They're basically magic," Toby insisted. "You've never even seen one." "You have never seen a wing lizard either," Fenna shot back, though her 4 eyes crinkled with something that looked suspiciously like amusement rather than genuine offense. "We are both arguing about creatures neither of us can prove exist anymore." Corin, listening nearby, felt something tighten unexpectedly in his chest. Fenna was right, in a way that went deeper than the childish argument itself. The wing lizards of Calith Prime no longer existed anywhere except in memory, torn apart along with the rest of their homeworld. Yet here she was, laughing about them with a human child who had never once made her feel like a stranger, a burden, or a curiosity to be studied. To Toby, she was simply Fenna, his loud, stubborn, endlessly interesting friend. Later that same week, Corin mentioned the friendship to Dr. Amara Osei, who had taken to visiting Ashen Hope regularly, even after the settlement no longer required intensive medical support from the relief fleet. "Toby talks about her constantly," Dr. Osei said, smiling. "Drives his parents a little crazy, honestly. Fenna this, Fenna that. I think he's decided she's the most interesting person he's ever met." "She has had very little reason to trust easily," Corin admitted. Losing her parents, losing her home, spending months uncertain whether she would even survive the journey here. I worried she might never fully recover from that. "Grief doesn't really go away," Dr. Osei said gently. "It just makes room for other things eventually, if you're lucky enough to have people around you who help make that room." Sounds like Toby's doing his part. Corin found himself thinking often about that conversation over the following weeks, watching as similar friendships and partnerships slowly formed throughout the settlement, not just among children, but among adults as well. Niyar Kes had taken to spending his evenings debating engineering theory with Priya Anand, the two of them sketching increasingly ambitious plans for expanding the settlement's power grid using a hybrid of human and Calith technology. Several Calith farmers had begun trading seed stock and cultivation techniques with human agricultural specialists, resulting in the settlement's first successful hybrid crop, a resilient grain that combined the hardiness of earth wheat with the nutritional density of a traditional Calith staple crop. Not every relationship formed easily, however. Captain Dross remained stubbornly distant from most human contact, limiting his interactions to strictly necessary logistics and administrative matters. He was polite, technically correct in every exchange, but never warm, never willing to extend the kind of casual friendship that seemed to be blooming naturally throughout the rest of the settlement. Corin confronted him about it directly one evening, frustrated after yet another tense council meeting where Dross had objected, seemingly out of habit, to a proposal for expanding joint human-Calith trade agreements beyond Ashen Hope's immediate needs. "You cannot deny what they have done for us," Corin said. 6 million lives saved, a functioning settlement built from nothing in under half a year, genuine friendships forming between our children. What more evidence do you require before you allow yourself to trust them? Dross was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening sky above Ashen Hope. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual sharp certainty. "It is not a matter of evidence, Corin. I believe what I have seen. I simply do not know how to exist within it. My entire life, I was taught caution above all else. Trust nothing offered freely. Question every act of generosity. Protect what remains of our people from exploitation at any cost." That caution kept our fleet alive during the worst weeks of our journey, when trusting the wrong empire might have meant losing everything. I do not know how to simply set it aside now, even when the evidence suggests I should. It was, Corin realized, the most honest thing Dross had ever said to him. Beneath the sharp suspicion and stubborn distance was simply an old, weary fear, one that had served a real purpose once and now struggled to find its place in a world that no longer required it in the same way. "No one is asking you to abandon caution entirely," Corin said, more gently than before. "Only to allow room for something else alongside it. Fenna has not forgotten her parents. Issa has not forgotten the sky burning red over Calith Prime. But they have found room, despite that grief, for something new. Perhaps you might allow yourself the same. Dross did not answer immediately, but several days later, Corin noticed him lingering at the edge of a settlement gathering, organized to celebrate the completion of Ashen Hope's first full harvest season, a joint human Caliph festival featuring food, music, and games from both cultures. Dross did not participate directly, remaining near the perimeter as was his habit, but he stayed the entire evening, watching quietly as human and Caliph families mingled freely across the settlement's central plaza, and for the first time since their arrival at Kes 7, Corin saw something on the old captain's face that looked almost like peace. Fleet Mother Issa, standing beside Corin as the festival's evening lanterns were lit, followed his gaze toward Dross and smiled faintly. "Trust does not arrive all at once," she said. "It arrives slowly, in small moments, until one day, a person realizes it has been there all along, waiting patiently to be noticed." Above the plaza, human and Caliph lanterns rose together into the violet evening sky, drifting upward like slow, quiet stars, marking 6 months since a distress signal had first been answered in under 6 minutes, and marking, perhaps, the true beginning of something neither species had fully understood they needed until it arrived. The trouble began, as trouble often does, far from Ashen Hope itself, in a meeting room on Earth that none of the settlement's residents would ever see. Admiral Renata Osei stood before a panel of United Nations budget officials, her posture straight, despite the exhaustion that had settled permanently into her shoulders over the past 7 months. The relief operation for the Caliph refugees had cost more than initial projections estimated, largely due to the extended timeline of the settlement's development and the ongoing medical, agricultural, and infrastructure support still flowing steadily toward Kes 7. "Admiral," said Councillor Bertrand Hale, a thin, sharp-featured man who had opposed the relief mission from its earliest days. "We are now 11 months into an operation, originally projected to require perhaps 4. Costs have exceeded initial estimates by nearly 60%. Meanwhile, the Larkspur colony continues to struggle with its own agricultural shortfall, a crisis affecting Earth citizens directly, and yet resources continue flowing toward an alien settlement with no formal treaty, no trade agreement, and no guaranteed return on this considerable investment." "The Caliph are not an investment, Counselor," Admiral Osei said evenly. "They are 6 million people who lost everything, given a chance to rebuild. The Larkspur shortfall is a serious issue, and I've already submitted a separate proposal to address it using entirely different resource allocations. The two situations do not need to compete against each other. They compete for the same limited funding, Admiral, whether you frame it that way or not," Councillor Hale replied. "I understand the humanitarian impulse behind this mission. I even admire it, in principle. But principle does not feed Earth citizens facing their own hardship. At what point does compassion for strangers become negligence toward our own people?" The question hung in the room, and Admiral Osei felt the weight of it more than she let herself show. She had asked herself some version of that same question more than once over the past months, usually late at night, staring at budget reports that never seemed to balance as cleanly as she wished they would. "I don't believe compassion for one group requires neglect of another, Counselor," she said finally. "But I understand the concern, and I won't pretend the resource strain isn't real. I'm requesting 30 days to present a revised support plan, one that reduces our direct involvement in Ashen Hope's development while transitioning the settlement toward greater self-sufficiency, without abandoning our commitment entirely." The Council granted her the 30 days, though not without further pointed remarks from Councillor Hale about the dangers of what he called unlimited generosity without unlimited resources. Admiral Osei left the meeting more troubled than she let her staff see. Word of the political tension reached Ashen Hope less than a week later, carried through official channels to Fleet Mother Yissa Thren, who called an emergency council meeting the moment she understood the implications. "They are considering reducing support," she told the assembled council, her voice carefully controlled despite the alarm evident beneath it. "Not eliminating it entirely, but scaling back significantly, sooner than originally planned. Our settlement remains dependent on human supply lines for certain critical resources, specialized medical equipment, advanced technology components, and continued food supplementation during the growing season transition." Dross, who had grown noticeably less hostile toward human presence over recent months, surprised the room by speaking first. "This was inevitable, was it not? We always understood their generosity carried practical limits. Perhaps it is simply time for us to stand more fully on our own." "Perhaps," Corin said, but the timing is dangerous. Our agricultural systems are not yet fully self-sufficient. Our medical infrastructure still relies heavily on human-supplied equipment we have not yet learned to manufacture ourselves. A sudden reduction in support, even a partial one, could create genuine hardship. Issa raised a hand, quieting the growing debate. We will not know the full extent of any changes until Admiral Osei presents her revised plan. Until then, panic serves no purpose. We should instead consider what we can do, immediately, to reduce our dependence and demonstrate our capacity to support ourselves. Over the following weeks, Ashen Hope threw itself into an intense period of self-directed effort. Niar Kess and his engineering teams worked around the clock, alongside a smaller contingent of human volunteers who remained, despite the uncertainty surrounding the mission's future funding, to establish local manufacturing capability for critical medical supplies. Caliph agricultural specialists, drawing on techniques learned from their human counterparts over the preceding months, accelerated the cultivation of the hybrid grain crop that had proven so successful earlier in the year, expanding fields rapidly to increase the settlement's food reserves ahead of any potential supply reduction. Corin found himself working longer hours than he had since the darkest days of the original evacuation, coordinating between Caliph engineering teams and the remaining human liaison staff, determined to ensure Ashen Hope could weather whatever changes came, without sliding back into the desperation of those first terrible months adrift in space. It was during this period of frantic preparation that the second crisis arrived, one far more immediate and dangerous than budget disputes on a distant council floor. A distress signal reached Ashen Hope's orbital monitoring station late one evening, not from the settlement itself, but from a small human supply convoy still en route to deliver a scheduled shipment of medical components. The convoy had been ambushed by the same pirate group that had shadowed the original refugee fleet months earlier, apparently emboldened by rumors that human military support for the KES-7 system had begun to wind down. Admiral Osei's response, when word reached her aboard the Mercy's Reach, was immediate and unhesitating. Despite the ongoing budget tensions back on Earth, despite Counselor Hale's pointed warnings about resource strain, she diverted a full military escort to intercept the pirate group and secure the convoy, personally overseeing the operation from the Mercy's Reach itself. The engagement lasted less than 2 hours. Human military escorts, trained and equipped far beyond the capability of the disorganized pirate group, secured the convoy with minimal casualties on either side. But the incident sent a clear message throughout both the settlement and back on Earth. Reducing support too quickly, too visibly, carried real risks beyond simple budget concerns. When Admiral Osei next appeared before the Council to present her revised support plan, she carried with her a full report on the pirate engagement, alongside detailed data demonstrating Ashen Hope's rapid progress towards self-sufficiency over the preceding weeks. The settlement has reduced its dependence on direct human supply by nearly 40% in under a month, she told the Council. They are not asking for indefinite support, Counselor Hale. They are asking for a reasonable transition period, one that does not leave them vulnerable to exactly the kind of threat we witnessed just days ago. I'm not proposing we maintain full-scale operations indefinitely. I'm proposing a measured, responsible reduction, one that doesn't abandon 6 million people the moment budget conversations get uncomfortable. Counselor Hale studied the report for a long moment before responding, his expression less certain than it had been during the previous meeting. The pirate engagement is a valid concern, he admitted grudgingly. I will not pretend otherwise. Very well, Admiral. Present your revised timeline. I make no promises regarding full Council approval, but I am willing to reconsider my earlier position. It was not a complete victory, not the kind of unconditional support Ashen Hope had received during its earliest, most desperate months. But it was enough, a measured, responsible path forward that acknowledged both Earth's legitimate resource concerns and the very real danger of withdrawing support too abruptly from a settlement not yet fully prepared to stand entirely on its own. When news of the Council's decision reached Ashen Hope, Fleet Mother Yisa gathered the settlement's council once more, this time with considerably less tension in the room than the previous emergency meeting had carried. Even when it became difficult for them, even when their own people questioned the cost, they chose to continue standing beside us. Perhaps this, more than anything else we have witnessed since our arrival, tells us who they truly are. Corin, standing near the back of the council chamber, thought of Admiral Osei's words from months earlier. Ask me again in 20 years. Ask me when your children and our children are running around together. He thought of Fenna and Toby, of Niarkes and Priya Anand's late-night engineering debates, of Dross's slowly softening distance from the human presence he had once viewed with such suspicion. 20 years remained a long way off, but for the first time, Corin found himself genuinely believing they might actually reach it together. News traveled slowly across the galaxy, carried along established trade routes and diplomatic channels that connected the great powers to one another, while largely ignoring smaller, newer settlements like Ashen Hope. But news did travel, eventually, and by the 10th month of the Calith settlement's existence, word of what had happened had reached even the distant halls of the Thessaran Concord and the cautious council chambers of the Vale hierarchy. The story reached them in fragments at first. A trade envoy passing through neutral space mentioned an unusual human settlement project involving alien refugees. A diplomatic report noted, almost as an afterthought, that the Calith ascendancy, once presumed extinct following the destruction of their homeworld, had in fact survived and resettled with human assistance. Slowly, the fragments assembled themselves into a fuller picture, and that picture made its way, eventually, into the formal proceedings of the Galactic Council itself. Fleet Mother Issa Thren learned of this development from Admiral Osei during one of the Admiral's periodic visits to Ashen Hope, now less frequent than during the settlement's earliest months, but still regular enough to maintain the friendship that had grown steadily between them. They want an explanation, Admiral Osei said, settling into a chair within Yissa's modest council office, a building constructed from a blend of salvaged ship materials and local timber that had become something of an architectural symbol for the settlement itself. The Galactic Council, I mean. Apparently, 6 million refugees successfully resettled by a species with no formal council standing raises some uncomfortable questions for an organization that spent considerable effort avoiding the same responsibility. Issa allowed herself a small, dry smile. Uncomfortable for them, perhaps. I imagine our survival contradicts several assumptions they preferred to leave unexamined. That's putting it politely, Admiral Osei said. I've heard from a few contacts that some council members are furious. Not at us exactly, though there's plenty of that too. Mostly at each other, for turning down the same request we said yes to in under a week. Nobody likes being reminded they made the wrong call, especially not in front of the whole galaxy. Word of the council's discomfort proved accurate. Over the following weeks, reports filtered back to Ashen Hope, detailing heated debates within the Galactic Council's chambers. Various member species attempting to justify their earlier refusal, while others quietly criticized humanity's decision as reckless, unsustainable, or driven by naive sentimentality rather than sound strategic judgment. They call it naive, Corin said one evening, reading through a summary of the council proceedings that Admiral Osei had shared with the settlement's leadership. As though saving 6 million lives requires justification beyond the fact that it was possible and no one else was willing to attempt it. People often call kindness naive when they lack the courage to practice it themselves, Issa observed. It is easier to dismiss generosity as foolish than to admit one's own caution was, in truth, simply unwillingness. Not every reaction from the wider galaxy proved critical, however. Several smaller, less powerful species, ones who had watched the great empire's initial refusal with quiet dismay, began reaching out independently to both the Human Relief Command and the Calith settlement itself, curious about the details of the resettlement, and, in a few cases, cautiously interested in establishing their own contact with humanity. One such approach came from a modest trade consortium representing the Farron Cooperative, a smaller alliance of independent worlds that had long struggled to gain meaningful standing within the Galactic Council's rigid hierarchy. Their initial message, addressed jointly to Fleet Mother Issa and Admiral Osei, was cautious but genuinely curious. We have observed the resettlement of the Calith people with great interest. The message read, Our own worlds have, on more than one occasion, faced crises met with similar indifference from the greater powers. We wish to understand more fully what circumstances led humanity to respond as they did, and whether such cooperation might extend, in time, to others facing similar hardship. Admiral Osei brought the message to Ashen Hope personally, discussing it at length with Issa and the Settlement Council. This is precisely what I hoped might happen, eventually, she admitted. Not that we did this for the sake of reputation. Understand. We did it because 6 million people needed help, plain and simple. But if what happened here encourages others to reconsider how they treat people in crisis, that's not a bad outcome either. Dross, present at the meeting, spoke up with an observation that surprised several members of the council, given his earlier skepticism toward human involvement. Perhaps this is the true cost Fleet Mother once wondered about, all those months ago. Not a debt demanded in return for aid, but an example set, one that other struggling peoples might follow when circumstances allow. Corin, listening nearby, found himself nodding in quiet agreement. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of unspoken cost Issa had speculated about during their earliest weeks on Kes 7. Not a price paid to humanity directly, but an obligation passed forward, a promise that the mercy shown to the Caliph might someday be shown by the Caliph themselves to others in need. Not all attention directed toward Ashen Hope proved friendly, however. Several weeks after the Farron Cooperative's initial contact, a formal delegation arrived from the Vale hierarchy, one of the powers who had originally refused the Caliph's distress call, requesting a direct meeting with both Fleet Mother Issa and representatives of the Human Relief Command. The meeting, held in Ashen Hope's newly constructed council hall, carried a noticeably different tone from the settlement's usual gatherings. The Vale delegate, a tall, formally dressed diplomat named Ambassador Threll Vask, spoke with careful, measured precision, clearly conscious of the political weight his words carried. The Vale hierarchy wishes to formally acknowledge the survival and successful resettlement of the Caliph people, Ambassador Vask began, his tone polite but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of tension. We recognize that our initial response to your distress call fell short of the assistance ultimately required. We wish now to discuss the possibility of renewed diplomatic and economic relations between our peoples. Issa listened carefully, her expression giving away little. You are asking to resume relations with a people you abandoned in their moment of greatest need, she said finally, her voice calm but pointed. I confess, Ambassador, I find myself curious what has changed your position so significantly in less than a year. Ambassador Vask shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to abandon the diplomatic overture entirely. Circumstances at the time were complicated, Fleet Mother. Resource limitations, political considerations within our own council. Circumstances remain complicated for every civilization, Ambassador, Issa interrupted, not unkindly, but firmly. Humanity faced their own resource limitations, their own political disagreements, as I understand quite clearly from Admiral Osei's own accounts. They chose to help regardless. Your people chose otherwise. I do not say this to shame you, Ambassador. I say it because I believe honesty serves both our peoples better than polite avoidance. The ambassador was quiet for a long moment before responding, and when he did, something in his careful diplomatic posture seemed to ease slightly, replaced by something more genuine. You are correct, Fleet Mother. I will not insult your intelligence with further excuses. My people made a choice we now recognize as short-sighted, driven by caution that, in hindsight, served no one well. I cannot undo that choice. I can only ask whether the Caliph people might be willing to build something new going forward, separate from the failures of the past. Issa considered this for a long moment, glancing briefly toward Admiral Osei, who remained silent throughout the exchange, allowing the Caliph leadership to navigate the moment on their own terms. We will consider renewed relations, Ambassador, Issa said finally, cautiously, and without haste. My people have learned, this past year, the value of genuine generosity freely given, and the emptiness of assistance offered only once it becomes politically convenient. Should the Vale hierarchy wish to demonstrate that your renewed interest reflects genuine change rather than simple political recalculation, I imagine there will be opportunities to prove it in time. The ambassador nodded, accepting the measured response without argument, and the delegation departed Ashen Hope shortly after, leaving behind a cautious opening for future dialogue rather than any firm commitment. That evening, Corin found Issa once more on the observation platform overlooking the settlement, watching the lights of Ashen Hope flicker on across the darkening landscape below. You handled the ambassador with more patience than I expected, he said. Patience is not forgiveness, Issa replied. It is simply the recognition that people and civilizations alike can change, given enough time and enough reason to do so. Humanity showed us that change is possible, Corin. by choosing generosity when caution would have been easier. Perhaps, in time, we owe it to others to extend that same possibility, even to those who once turned us away. Below them, the settlement continued its quiet nighttime rhythm. 6 million people, no longer merely surviving, but beginning, cautiously and deliberately, to shape their place within a galaxy that was slowly, unevenly, learning to reconsider what it thought it knew about both the Caliph and the humans who had refused to leave them behind. 3 years passed, and Ashen Hope no longer looked like a settlement built from desperation and salvaged parts. It looked like a city. The central plaza, once a muddy stretch of half-finished construction equipment and temporary shelter modules, now held a proper marketplace, where Caliph farmers sold hybrid grain alongside human traders offering goods shipped in from Earth and its colonies. The council hall had been rebuilt in stone and steel, its architecture a deliberate blend of Caliph curves and human practicality. Designed jointly by Niar Kes and Priya Anand, who had married the year before, in a ceremony that combined traditions from both their peoples so thoroughly that neither side could quite say afterward which parts had been whose idea originally. Fleet Mother Issa Thren, though she still carried the title, had begun quietly preparing the settlement for a transition in leadership. She was older now, visibly so, her movements slower than they had been during those frantic early months of survival and resettlement. She spent more of her time mentoring the settlement's rising generation of administrators than making decisions herself, though she remained, by unanimous agreement of the council, the settlement's guiding voice whenever truly difficult matters arose. Corin Val had changed as well, though less visibly. He served now as Ashen Hope's chief liaison to Earth, a formal position that had not existed during those first uncertain weeks, when he was simply a young officer volunteering to fly a scout ship into unknown territory because no one else was willing to try. The suspicion that once colored so much of his thinking about humanity had long since faded, replaced by something closer to genuine partnership, though he still occasionally caught himself surprised by small human customs that remained unfamiliar even after 3 years of close contact. The most visible sign of how far the settlement had come, however, walked through Ashen Hope's streets every day in the form of its children. Fenna was 15 now, tall for her age, having grown into the quiet confidence that had first begun blossoming during those early days on the playground with Toby Reyes. She worked several afternoons a week alongside Niar Kes's engineering teams, having developed an early talent for mechanical design that Niar himself described, with obvious pride, as unlike anything he had seen in a Caliph her age. Toby, now 16, had taken to agricultural science, spending his weekends in the settlement's expanding fields, working alongside Caliph farmers to develop new hybrid crop varieties suited to the local climate. Their friendship had never faded, exactly, though it had changed shape as they grew older, settling into something quieter and more comfortable than the loud, argumentative companionship of their childhood. They remained, by most accounts throughout the settlement, close enough that people had stopped remarking on the unusual nature of their friendship entirely. It was simply understood, the way many things about Ashen Hope's mixed community had come to be understood, not as an oddity requiring explanation, but as an ordinary fact of daily life. It was Fenna, in fact, who provided one of the settlement's proudest moments during the 3rd anniversary celebration of Ashen Hope's founding. The celebration itself had grown considerably from its earlier, more modest origins. What had once been a simple gathering to mark the settlement's first harvest had become an annual event, drawing visitors from across the growing network of relationships the Caliph had cultivated since their resettlement. Human dignitaries from Earth, a small delegation from the Farron Cooperative who had, over the past 2 years, established genuine trade and cultural exchange with both the Caliph and, cautiously, with humanity itself, and even a modest representative presence from the Vale hierarchy, whose renewed relations with the Caliph had progressed slowly but steadily since Ambassador Vask's initial visit years earlier. Admiral Renata Osei attended as well, older now, having transitioned from active fleet command to a senior advisory role within the United Nations Relief and Diplomatic Corps, though she made a point of visiting Ashen Hope personally, whenever her schedule allowed, unwilling to let the friendship she had built with Issa and Corin fade into mere formal correspondence. The anniversary's central event, as had become tradition, involved a public demonstration of the settlement's ongoing achievements showcasing projects developed jointly between Caliph and human specialists over the preceding year. Fenna, now old enough to present her own work rather than simply assist Niarkes with his, stood before the assembled crowd to unveil a prototype water reclamation system she had designed, one intended to further reduce Ashen Hope's dependence on external resource shipments by improving the efficiency of the settlement's existing water treatment infrastructure. I began this project, Fenna explained to the crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the plaza despite her evident nervousness, because I wanted to build something that made Ashen Hope stronger, using what I learned from both Caliph engineering traditions and human innovation. I do not think either alone could have produced this design. It required both. The demonstration proved successful, the prototype system operating exactly as intended, and the crowd's applause carried a warmth that went beyond simple appreciation for a clever piece of engineering. It was, Corin realized, watching from near the front of the gathering, a small but powerful symbol of everything the settlement had become, not merely a place where Caliph refugees had been given shelter, but a genuine home, where an entirely new generation, raised across two cultures simultaneously, was beginning to build something neither culture could have created alone. After the formal demonstrations concluded, Corin found himself standing beside Admiral Osei near the edge of the plaza, watching the evening's festivities unfold around them. "You were right, all those years ago," Corin said, "about asking you again in 20 years whether this was worth it. We are not there yet, but I find myself already certain of the answer." Admiral Osei smiled, watching Fenna nearby, now surrounded by a small group of admiring younger children asking eager questions about her water reclamation prototype. "I had a feeling you might say that. 3 years isn't 20, Corin, but it's enough to see the shape of things clearly enough, I think." "Do you regret nothing about this mission?" Corin asked, echoing a question he had asked once before, long ago, aboard the observation deck of the Mercy's Reach. "Even now, knowing everything it cost your people, politically and materially." Admiral Osei considered the question seriously, as she always did. "I regret that it took a crisis this severe to bring our two peoples together in the first place. I regret every empire that turned you away before we ever got the chance to say yes. But the mission itself?" She shook her head, watching the plaza's warm lights glow against the evening sky. "No, Corin, I don't regret a single day of it." Fleet Mother Issa joined them shortly after, moving more slowly than she once had, though her presence still carried the same quiet authority it always had. She watched the celebration in comfortable silence for a while before speaking. "I have been considering," she said eventually, "who among our people should carry this settlement forward once I am no longer able to guide it myself. It is not a decision I make lightly." Corin glanced at her, surprised by the sudden topic, though he had known, in some quiet corner of his mind, that this conversation would eventually come. "You have someone in mind already, I think." Issa's gaze drifted toward Fenna, still surrounded by curious younger children near her prototype display, Toby standing nearby with the easy, comfortable patience of someone who had spent years growing alongside her. "Perhaps," Issa said simply, "though that decision remains some years distant yet. For now, I am content simply to watch what she and her generation continue to build." Above Ashen Hope, the settlement's lanterns rose once more into the evening sky, as they had every anniversary since the first harvest celebration years before, drifting upward like slow, patient stars above a city built not through conquest or inheritance, but through the deliberate, ongoing choice of two very different peoples to keep choosing each other, year after year, long after the original crisis that had first brought them together had faded into memory and, increasingly, into legend. 20 years came, as years do, quietly, and then all at once. Fleet Mother Yisa Thren did not live to see the full 20 years pass. She died peacefully in her sleep, during the settlement's 17th year, in the small stone house she had chosen for herself, near the edge of Ashen Hope's central plaza, surrounded by the city she had helped build from nothing but desperation and 6 million lives worth saving. Her passing was mourned across the settlement, and word of it traveled far beyond Kes 7 as well, carried by the extensive network of relationships the Caliph had built over the preceding 2 decades. Representatives from Earth, from the Farron Cooperative, and even a formal delegation from the Vale hierarchy attended her memorial, standing alongside thousands of Caliph and human citizens who had grown up knowing Ashen Hope not as a refugee settlement, but simply as home. By then, leadership of the settlement had already passed, gradually and deliberately, into the hands of the generation Issa herself had once watched grow up in Ashen Hope's streets and schools. Fenna, she had taken the Fleet Mother's family name formally during her 25th year, an honor Issa herself had insisted upon before her passing, having long ago come to think of the girl as something like the daughter she had never had the chance to raise, now served as Ashen Hope's chief administrator, a role that had evolved considerably from the original council structure established during the settlement's earliest, most uncertain days. Under her guidance, the settlement had grown into a genuine city of over 8 million people. Its population expanded, not only through the natural growth of the original 6 million refugees and their descendants, but through a steady stream of both Kalith survivors from scattered remnant populations across the galaxy, and human settlers drawn by the unique opportunities Ashen Hope's mixed society offered. Toby Reyes, now a leading figure in the settlement's agricultural research division, had spent the better part of 2 decades developing hybrid crop varieties that combined the best qualities of both Kalith and Earth agriculture, innovations that had since spread far beyond Ashen Hope itself. Adopted by struggling colonies throughout human territory and, increasingly, by other species as well, who had begun approaching the settlement directly for agricultural partnership rather than working solely through official Earth diplomatic channels. Their partnership, both personal and professional, had become one of Ashen Hope's quiet, enduring symbols. Proof, as many in the settlement liked to say, that the bond between Kalith and human had grown far beyond the original crisis that first brought the two peoples together. Corin Vall, now well into his later years himself, though still active in the settlement's diplomatic affairs, stood on the observation platform overlooking Ashen Hope's central plaza on the morning of the settlement's 20th anniversary, watching the city stir to life below him. It was, he thought, remarkably similar in feeling to that first observation platform conversation he had shared with Issa so many years before, though the view itself had changed almost beyond recognition. Where once there had been muddy construction sites and temporary shelter modules, there now stood a genuine skyline, blending Kalith architectural curves with human structural innovation into something that belonged entirely to neither culture alone, and entirely to both at once. Admiral Renata Osei joined him on the platform shortly after, considerably older now, though she still carried herself with the same brisk, purposeful energy that had first arrived at the edge of Kalith refugee space 20 years earlier. She had long since retired from active service, though she remained, by her own insistence, a permanent fixture at Ashen Hope's anniversary celebrations, unwilling to miss a single one since the very first. "You once told me to ask you again in 20 years, Corin said, as she settled beside him at the platform railing. "Whether it was worth it." "I remember," Admiral Osei said, smiling as she looked out over the city below. "I believe I also told you I already knew the answer, even back then." "You did," Corin agreed. "I find myself curious whether the answer has changed at all, now that the 20 years have actually arrived." Admiral Osei considered the city spread before them, the joint human Kalith University that Fenna had helped establish a decade earlier, now producing graduates who moved seamlessly between both cultures' traditions and innovations. The agricultural research campus where Toby's team continued developing crop varieties, now feeding struggling worlds across a dozen different systems. The diplomatic quarter, where representatives from a growing list of galactic civilizations maintained permanent offices, drawn by Ashen Hope's unique position as a genuine bridge between humanity and the wider galaxy, built not through conquest or careful political maneuvering, but through an act of simple, unconditional generosity that had rippled outward far beyond anyone's original expectations. "No," she said finally. "The answer hasn't changed at all. If anything, it's grown clearer with every year that's passed." Later that morning, the settlement gathered for its traditional anniversary ceremony, now held in a permanent amphitheater, built specifically for the occasion years earlier, large enough to accommodate the tens of thousands who traveled from across Ashen Hope and beyond to attend each year. Fenna stood at the ceremony's center, addressing the crowd with the same quiet confidence Corin remembered from her very first public demonstration 2 decades before, though her voice now carried the weight of genuine leadership rather than youthful nervousness. 20 years ago, she began, 6 million people drifted through empty space, abandoned by every civilization capable of helping them, save one. We were strangers to humanity then, unknown and unproven, offering nothing in return, for the aid we so desperately needed. And still, they came. Not because treaty or obligation demanded it, but because they could not bring themselves to look away from suffering they had the power to ease. She paused, glancing briefly toward where Corin and Admiral Osei stood together near the front of the gathered crowd. I did not fully understand, as a child, what that choice truly meant. I understood only that I was warm, and fed, and safe, after months of fearing I would be none of those things ever again. It has taken 20 years for me to fully understand the deeper truth of what humanity taught us that day, and every day since. That a civilization's greatness is measured not by what it demands from others, but by what it is willing to give, without demanding anything in return. The crowd's applause rose warm and genuine across the amphitheater, but Fenna raised a hand, indicating she was not yet finished. 20 years ago, we were given a debt we could never fully repay, she continued. Today, I am proud to say that we have found our own way to honor that debt, not by repaying it directly, for such generosity cannot truly be repaid in kind, but by extending the same choice humanity once made for us, to others, now facing their own moments of crisis and abandonment. She gestured toward a small delegation seated near the front of the amphitheater, representatives, Corin knew, of a newly displaced people from a distant system, victims of a natural catastrophe eerily similar to the one that had destroyed Calith Prime 2 decades earlier, who had reached out to Ashen Hope directly in recent months, having heard of the settlement's own history, and hoping, cautiously, that the same mercy might be extended to them as well. We have already begun coordinating relief efforts alongside our human partners, Fenna announced, to ensure that no people, ever again, need face what we once faced entirely alone. The applause that followed carried a different quality than before, not simple celebration, but something closer to quiet, collective pride, the sense of an entire community recognizing, together, the full circle their history had finally completed. That evening, as Ashen Hope's traditional anniversary lanterns rose once more into the darkening sky, Corin found himself standing beside Admiral Osei near the edge of the plaza, much as he had every year since the settlement's earliest days. Issa once told me, he said quietly, watching the lanterns drift upward like slow, patient stars, that perhaps the price of humanity's generosity was simply this, that we remember, and that someday, when others found themselves abandoned and desperate,